He finally knelt down, heart trembling, hands shaking, ready to propose to the only woman who ever healed him. But instead of blessings, James received the cruelest words a parent can give. If you marry her, you're no longer my son. Imagine hearing that. Imagine choosing love, knowing it may cost you the man who raised you, the family you came from, the life you once knew. Tonight, we're diving into the moment James's world split in two. The moment he was forced to choose between the woman who gave him peace and the father who gave him everything except love. What would you choose? If this story touches your heart, please subscribe my channel. We really appreciate your support. We're working so hard to reach 1,000 subs, and every single click means the world to us. The office that afternoon felt like it was holding its breath. The quiet hum of air conditioning, the soft tapping of keyboards, the rustle of paper. Everything seemed too loud for the heavy tension sitting in James's chest. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone vibrated hard across the polished conference table. He glanced down. Dad. His heart tightened immediately. Even from the other side of the room, a few employees noticed the way his shoulders stiffened. He stood abruptly. "Excuse me." His voice was too calm for someone whose pulse had just doubled. He stepped away, pressing the phone to his ear. "Dad, how's the branch? Everything stable?" But Mr. Sun's voice blasted through the speaker, sharp enough that even the employee presenting froze mid-sentence. "Cut the nonsense. Tell me, are you still planning that ridiculous wedding with Diep?" The words slammed into him, but James had been expecting this storm for months. "Dad, we've been together for years. We're preparing to ruin your future?" his father thundered. "Preparing to humiliate your family name? If you dare marry that girl, I will cut ties with you. Completely. I will not acknowledge you as my son." The room around James tilted. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. "Dad, don't say that." But the line went dead. James stood frozen, phone shaking in his grasp. Across the conference room, the employee quietly gathered her papers, bowing quickly before slipping out. Nobody wanted to be near the explosion, still vibrating in the air. James pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. Cold sweat ran down his spine. His father wasn't just angry today. He was declaring war. Because to Mr. Sun, Diep was a threat. Poor, uneducated, unworthy of their status. But to James, she was the one place where life felt warm again. She was laughter on difficult days. She was calm when he faltered. She was home. But now choosing her meant risking losing the man who raised him. Back at the Sun mansion, the storm continued. Mr. Sun paced the grand living room like a restless shadow, every footstep loud against marble floors. His pride filled the air like smoke. "That girl will drag him down. I won't let him destroy everything I built," he barked. On the sofa, Mrs. Huyen sat quietly. But today, her calmness had cracked. Her fingers trembled as she tried to speak. "You're not listening," she said softly. "James is grown. He knows what he's doing." "You're blinded by emotion," he snapped back, slamming his palm on the table until a vase rattled. "She's uneducated, poor. She brings nothing. She brings him joy," Mrs. Huyen cut in, her voice breaking for the first time. "Something you haven't given him in years." Her eyes glistened. "You gave us a house, a career, stability, but not softness, not warmth." Her words hit him, a rare blow, but pride kept his jaw locked. "If he marries her," he said coldly, "he is no longer my son." He stormed out, leaving the chandelier trembling behind him. On the sofa, Mrs. Huyen's tears finally fell. "James, I'm so sorry," she whispered to the empty room. That evening, James turned off the road and drove up a steep hillside. The rugged trail kicked dust into the air, but he didn't slow down. His mind was a storm of hurt, anger, and fear. Diep sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching him from the corner of her eye. His silence said enough. Another fight with his father. Another wound he tried to hide behind a stiff jaw and steady breath. When they reached the top of the hill, the sunset painted the sky in soft gold and pink. The valley below stretched in peaceful silence, red roofs glowing in the dusk, smoke drifting lazily from kitchen fires. Diep stepped out and opened her arms to the wind. "I've never seen anything this beautiful," she said softly. James stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, but his hold was different today. Tighter, heavier, desperate. "I brought you here," he murmured, "because I need to tell you something." She turned toward him, worry already blooming in her eyes. He led her toward a flat rock overlooking the entire valley. They sat. Sunset light brushed her cheeks, turning her eyes into glimmering glass. "My dad," he exhaled shakily. "He doesn't want me to marry you. He said he'll cut ties with me. Forever." Diep's fingers froze around his. Her breath hitched. "James, I don't want you to lose your father because of me." "Don't say that," he said quickly, voice cracking in a way she'd never heard. "Don't ever say that." She looked away, tears forming. "I don't want to be the reason you choose between your family and me." "But I've already chosen," James whispered. Then, suddenly, he dropped to one knee. Diep gasped, hands flying to her mouth. He opened a small velvet box. 2 rings glowed softly in the fading light, humble but full of meaning. "This isn't the third proposal," he said with a trembling laugh. "This is me putting the ring on first, because I'm ready, truly ready." Tears streamed down Diep's cheeks. "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared I wasn't enough. But I can't reject you again." His hands shook as he slid the ring onto her finger. Diep stared at it, voice trembling. "It's beautiful." James pulled her into an embrace, burying his face in her hair. "We'll marry," he said softly, "even if the world stands against us." Diep held him tightly. "I'll wait for you, no matter how long, no matter who tries to stop us." The last light of the sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving their silhouettes locked together beneath a purple sky. 2 rings glimmered faintly in the dark. 2 hearts made a choice that would cost them everything. Morning crept over the valley slowly, but neither James nor Diep felt its warmth. The drive down the hillside was quiet. Too quiet. James kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other holding Diep's fingers tightly, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Dust rose behind them, fading into the dawn. When the car stopped in front of Diep's small gate, she turned to step out, but James gently caught her wrist. "Diep," he whispered, voice scraped raw by everything he'd endured. "No matter what happens next, I'm choosing you." She looked up at him, eyes shimmering under the flickering porch light. "And I'm choosing you," she said softly. "Always." But even as the words left her lips, her fingers trembled. She tried to hide it. James felt it anyway. Inside her tiny kitchen, Diep began making dinner. Simple dishes she'd learned to cook since she was a child. Fish soup simmering quietly, steamed vegetables, a pot of warm rice. The space smelled like home, like comfort, like a life built from gentleness rather than wealth. She hummed while she cooked, but her movements were off. Her hand paused halfway through stirring the soup. She stared at the steam for too long. Her shoulders held a tension she didn't even realize she carried. James stepped behind her, resting a hand lightly on her arm. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. She froze. A shaky breath slipped from her lips before she turned to face him. "Your father hates me, James." Her voice wavered. "He doesn't even know me, but he hates everything he thinks I am." His heart clenched. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "He hates losing control," James murmured. "Not you. And even if he does hate you, he'll have to learn to stop." Then he said the word that made her knees go weak. "Because you're going to be my wife." Diep's eyes filled instantly, not from sadness, from how overwhelming it felt to be chosen so fiercely by someone she once thought was too far out of reach. They ate together in quiet, both lost in swirling thoughts. After dinner, she walked him to the gate. The night air buzzed softly with crickets and faraway motorbike engines. "Good night," she whispered. James leaned down, kissed her forehead gently. "Good night, fiancé." She blushed, pushing him lightly, but her eyes glowed with a warmth that lived somewhere deeper than happiness itself. Yet as he drove away, she couldn't ignore the knot of fear tightening in her chest. The next morning, the Sun household felt colder than usual. The expensive furniture, the polished wood floors, the quiet clink of coffee cups. Everything felt tense and unwelcoming. Mr. Sun sat rigidly at the breakfast table, jaw tight, fingers tapping an angry rhythm on the cup he refused to drink from. Across from him, Mrs. Huyen stared at her untouched bowl of soup, her eyes swollen from crying through the night. "You're hurting your own child," she whispered. "He's hurting himself," her husband snapped back. "That girl is not worthy of him. She's not our class, not our match." "She's gentle," she countered softly. "And she stood by him through storms you never even knew existed." His nostrils flared. "I don't care. If he marries her, he's dead to me." The words landed like thunder. Mrs. Huyen covered her face, her shoulders trembling. "You'll regret this," she said weakly. A father should never be the one to break his child's heart. But pride, thick and poisonous, wrapped around Mr. Sun and refused to let him soften, even though pain flickered quietly behind his anger. Meanwhile, at the morning market, life rushed on with noisy chatter and the smell of fresh produce. Diep arranged vegetables neatly, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Her face was tired, her smile forced, but she pushed through for the sake of the customers who greeted her warmly. When James appeared in front of the stall, she froze. "You came this early?" she whispered. "I needed to see you." He stepped closer, blocking out the bustling world around them. "Last night, I couldn't sleep." "Because of your father," she murmured. "Because you're afraid I'll change my mind." James gently lifted her chin. "I won't." Diep's breath caught in her throat. "Then, what do we do first?" she whispered. James smiled softly. "We start planning. Today." Her eyes widened. "Our wedding?" "Yes," he said. "Even if my dad refuses to come. Even if he cuts ties. even if it's just you and me standing alone. Diep's hands tightened around the edge of the stall. I don't want you to lose your family because of me. I can't lose you, James said simply. She broke then, tears slipping down her cheeks in front of customers and all. James reached forward and wiped them gently with his thumb. Don't cry, he murmured. Today should be happy. It's the first day we start our future. She nodded, tears still falling, but a fragile smile blooming on her lips. Okay, she whispered. Let's begin. That evening, when James returned home, the entire house felt different. Dim lights, heavy silence, and his father sitting alone on the sofa, staring at old photographs. Pictures of James when he was small, smiling wide, tugging his father's sleeve. Memories of a time before pride consumed everything. James approached slowly. Dad, he said quietly, we need to talk. If it's about that girl, his father replied without looking up, save your breath. I love her, James said, refusing to falter, and I'm going to marry her. Finally, Mr. Sun lifted his eyes. Sharp, angry, but underneath it all, filled with fear. Then we're done, he said coldly. The words sliced through the room. James swallowed, forcing himself to stay steady. I don't want to lose you, but I can't lose Diep either. She gives you nothing, his father spat. James's voice softened. She gives me peace. She gives me purpose. She gives me a home that isn't made of glass and silence. Something in his father's face cracked for a second, a flash of hurt, but pride shoved it away. You choose her, he whispered. You lose me. James's chest ached brutally, but he didn't back down. Then I choose her. The silence afterward was suffocating. Finally, Mr. Sun forced out 2 words. Get out. James inhaled shakily, then nodded. I hope someday you forgive me, he said quietly. But until then, I'm still your son, whether you claim me or not. He walked out. Behind him, his father's face twisted, not with rage, but with heartbreak he refused to show. Under the soft glow of the street lamp, James dialed the only number that felt like home now. She answered instantly. James? It's time, he whispered. For what? For us to officially start our wedding preparations. Diep covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Are you sure? She whispered. James looked at the empty street ahead, their future, and said softly, I'm sure. And for the first time in days, hope finally returned to his chest. The war with his father had begun, but so had the wedding. James finally decides to marry the woman who healed him, but what should have been a beautiful milestone becomes the hardest battle of his life. The moment his father hears the news, he explodes with rage, declaring the cruelest ultimatum a parent can give. If you marry her, you're no longer my son. Shaken but determined, James takes Diep to a quiet mountain peak, where he places a ring on her finger and chooses love despite the storm ahead. But the consequences hit immediately. His mother breaks down, torn between her husband's pride and her son's happiness. His father's fury grows into cold silence, and Diep fears she's destroying the family James once belonged to. Yet James refuses to step back. He chooses her, even if it means losing everything. The war with his father has begun, but so has their wedding.